series of essays anonymously published defending the document to the public. No one will read it. I disagree.
Welcome back, folks. So we saw in our first video that Madison wants to use the institution of the national legislature to thwart dangerous factions. If the legislature is properly structured, he seems to say, no factional interest will result in legislation. Only something that's truly for the public good could be agreed upon by all of the representatives. So the institution of representation in what's called the extensive republic pits the interest of one faction against those of another so that neither interest will win. In a sense, you could say that Madison's institutionalist thought in Federalist 10 amounts to this: hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. Hope for virtuous representatives, but have institutions that neutralize their vices. Neutralize them how? Well, simply by setting them at odds with each other. But Madison was never really satisfied with this simple answer. He kept on thinking about the question, how should we prepare for the worst? What principles should we use to shape our institutions? Well, Madison's thought on institutions had really developed quite significantly into a well-rounded theory by the time he wrote Federalist 51, which we're going to take a close look at together. In that Federalist paper, Madison spells out what has traditionally been called the theory of checks and balances, but that's not actually a term that he uses very much. It's in the title of 51, but it doesn't recur there. And for other reasons too, it would really be better to call Madison's theory a theory of institutions. Institutions is a more general word, which you'll see applied more broadly across lots of areas in the study of political science. So, at any rate, Madison's concern in 51 is to show that the Constitution will guarantee that one branch of government never gets too much power, such that a faction could actually capture that branch and then use it to effect its own selfish plans. He says that the framers basically took care that the various parts of the government would always stay within the bounds of their own power, in their proper places, as he says. How did the framers take care to see that? Well, as he says in maybe the most important passage in the Federalist Papers entirely, he says the framers sought to give, quote, those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments by others. He says this on page 319 to 320. And then he goes on. Again, very, very famous passage. So we're going to take a look at it right here. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interests of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men, over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. A dependence on the people is, no doubt, the primary control on the government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. So, really, this expresses Madison's theory of institutions pretty fully. First, you start with the assumption that human nature can, at times, be bad, or at least it's not angelic. It's because men are no angels that they need a government over them in the first place, presumably to keep them from violating each other's rights, as in Federalist 10, he says. The government, therefore, has got to have a certain strength to stop offenses, but not too much strength, or else it will become an even more fearsome threat to rights. So the government must be able to control the governed, but then it must itself be controlled. Elections, by which it's hoped that the people will put virtuous men in charge and some sympathy between ruler and ruled will emerge, those are the first method of controlling the government. But it can't be hoped that the reliance on sympathy and virtue will be enough, so ambition must be made to counteract ambition. One man must be given a set of powers in government such that his personal motives, his own fame and advancement, we could think, depend on his keeping the others in check. For instance, the power and prestige of a senator will rely on keeping a president in check. That is, especially if the senator wants to achieve that office of president. Likewise, the president's power relies on keeping senators from having more powers than they're assigned by the Constitution. So if the whole system works, in the end, no one person, no one branch will have enough power to become a violator of rights, because each branch will work to keep the others in check. And none of this will rely on virtuous men being in office, constraining themselves, for instance, to do only what they should or what they ought to do. Indeed, even if all men seek to go well beyond the limits of their assigned powers, they will not be able to. As Madison says in 51, the private interest of every individual may be a sentinel over the public rights. So hope for the best, but prepare for the worst, now on steroids. This is more than just Federalist number 10, where he said that in a large country, no one would be able to win a coalition large enough to pass their selfish plans. Now, selfishness itself is the plan. But okay, the question now becomes, what's going to be the character of the laws that will be passed under these democratic institutions? We already saw at the beginning of our lectures that Madison is concerned with two things: that government be able to pursue the common good, and that it do so without trampling on rights. But as I suggested before, his idea of the common good isn't terribly high-flown. He says this in Federalist 51 on page 322. He says, "In the extended Republic of the United States, and among the great variety of interests, parties, and sects which it embraces, a coalition of a majority of the whole society could seldom take place on any other principles than those of justice and the general good." And here's what he seems to mean by that. Once the interests of various different factions are canceled out, which occurs according to the theory of the extensive republic, but also by ambition counteracting ambition, as the politicians jockey against each other for position, all that's going to be left for our representatives to be able to agree on is the, quote, general good. But what would this general good be? Madison really gives us no answer, and so we have to rely on his theory of interests. That's all there is in this Federalist paper. Each person develops their own set of interests, material, property interests, and in some cases, their interest will be one that is peculiar to them or which they share only with those around them. This he calls a factional interest. And that's the sort of interest that he thinks will be impossible to push through democratic institutions. But by implication, we could think here that in other cases, the person's interest, be that an interest in expanded trade among the states, or trade between the United States and foreign lands, or an interest in the level of taxes that are going to be levied on imported or exported goods, or any other material interest that you could think of. A person's interests will sometimes coincide with the interests of his neighbors. It's still going to be based on self-interest, but a self-interest that at least some others, through their representatives, could also agree to. In this case, if enough people share in the interest, then the public good is really just the happy coincidence of so many private goods. In this sense, he might believe that there's nothing of value except the individual's interests, the individual's interest in his material well-being, his property. Factional interests are wrong because they will end up violating some individual's interests or property. If some small number of people want X that damages the interests or property of other people, then X is the wrong thing to do. But larger, more broadly shared interests are good for many, and we might think violate very few. Institutions, then, are to protect interests. There's nothing else we can presume from his theory. There's no other explanation of what the public good would be. So institutions are structures that steer essentially self-interested men towards producing some social outcome which they themselves could not have produced on their own. So institutions are structures that steer essentially self-interested men towards producing some social outcome which they themselves could not have produced on their own. Without institutions to guide their interests, men would find themselves always at odds and always seeking to use their power to take from others, violating their rights. But with Madisonian democratic institutions, they're able to weed out factious interests that set them apart, like the interest of the poor in violating property rights, and to find that they can sort of serve each other's individual material interests in at least some ways. If they can serve each other's interests, Madison seems to be saying, then they've found the public good. So Madison, the practical politician, seemed to be saying that there was nothing higher that could be aimed for. But nevertheless, there was a certain melancholy in his statements on this, a certain resignation to the fact that man couldn't achieve any higher good. If the tendency of man was to warp power to his own ends, and if that tendency was so great, then man perhaps blocks himself from achieving anything better than simply like I said, a happy coincidence of a bunch of self-interests. So as Madison says in a particular mood in Federalist 41, on page 266, he says, "Cool and candid people will at once reflect that the purest of human blessings must have a portion of alloy in them, that the choice must be made, if not of the lesser evil, at least of the greater, not the perfect good, and that in every political institution, a power to advance the public happiness involves a discretion which may be misapplied and abused. They will see, therefore, that in all cases where power is to be conferred, the point first to be decided is whether such a power be necessary to the public good, and the next will be, in the case of an affirmative decision, to guard as effectually as possible against a perversion of that power to the public detriment." Now, could this melancholy mood of Madison's be explained by his losses at the convention? Maybe he had hoped for more, a better set of institutions, a more high-flown set of goals. But he only got the Constitution that he got, a cynical Constitution, one built upon what's been called the low ground of interests. Perhaps his mood in Federalist 51 is determined by the fact that he's simply defending the Constitution that he got. Institutions, in this case, are a mere balance of interest-propelled forces, as one critic has called them, rather than justice and the commitment of each person to the good of others. He got institutions in which everyone just jockeys for their own interests, finding ways to make deals with others that they can agree to because those deals satisfy lots of people's interests. A constitution, Madison seemed to get with no mechanism for anyone, including judges, to consider the wisdom or the justice of laws, in order to hark back to a couple of key words from our lectures last week, but a constitution that only had a mechanism for the mutual gratification of self-interest. Those are some themes that I want you to consider in the few days you have before our discussion on those topics, and to consider how they make you assess anew, in some ways, the U.S. Constitution. I look forward to talking with you about it.